good morning and welcome to No Code Automation 101, how to create the right portfolio for your campus. So a little bit about me. My name is Katie Gaston. I'm with Kuali, and in my day job, I am a marketer. I will readily admit that out of the front gate, I'm a marketer. But with that said, my true passion in life authentically is automating as much as I can. I don't like having a process that takes me way too long. And I have a hobby, I would say, when someone tells me a process that they're like, I just can't figure this out, I immediately start solutioning how to make that better for them. So I love my job because I get the opportunity to help people work more efficiently and share my knowledge of automation and process efficiency with them. I'm a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt certified. And I have been trained in project management as well. So that background helps me, I would say, yes, market, but more authentically, probably just help people improve their own processes. With that in mind, I'm sure you've all heard this, but nothing is truly certain in life, as Benjamin Franklin once said, but death and taxes, and ultimately that we can agree that there's never really enough time. Now in a PMP, or in project management, I guess you could say training, there's a concept of a golden triangle. Now what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is why process efficiency is really important. And as part of that, how do you really begin your search for an automation tool? In project management training, like I said, there's a concept of a golden triangle. You have three controls you can really adjust when you're managing the scope of a project. You can either adjust time, adjust scope, or adjust cost. So if we look at these in the context of higher education, typically speaking, time on a task is fixed. You can't just create more time. Now, granted, you could take a longer period of time to do something, but ideally that's going to, or ultimately that's going to reduce the quality of your output. So exceeding time reduces quality of output, which means, well, it's not fixed inherently, it is in the sense of we don't really want to reduce that level of quality. Now, if we go over to the left-hand side, let's say scope. You could try to reduce the actual amount of work that you have to do. But again, it's mostly fixed. Now, granted, if you cut things out or if you focus on what's most important, it definitely can improve this level of scope. But ultimately, cutting out critical tasks will lead to reduced quality. And then finally, that leaves cost. And this is really ultimately, I would say, where we have a lot of variability. We can either do one of two things when it comes to cost. We can either increase the amount of people, increase the resources that we have, throwing more people at a problem. It could potentially increase or decrease the time it takes to complete it and potentially make things happen faster. But ultimately, as we've probably seen, generally speaking, having more people is not always an option. Often, in fact, doing more with less is generally what we're experiencing today, which leads to the other way to reduce costs, which is decrease inefficiencies. By creating more task efficiencies, you have the ability to reduce overall cost and ultimately lead to spending more time on actually what matters most, which leads us to then thinking about how do we do this for our institutions. Now, I think one thing that I always really like to talk to clients about, I have a background in professional services, and one of the things, while I would love to say, if you have the best tool, you're going to solve all your problems, that's not always the case. Inefficient tools don't lead to 100% inefficient processes, but they entirely contribute to inefficient processes. Inefficiencies can be caused by a lot of things. Can be caused by people, it can be caused by processes, and ultimately true, it is caused by some of the tools that we have at our disposal. So while inefficient tools aren't fully responsible for inefficient processes, they make a really big difference in the mix. By therefore increasing the effectiveness of the tools that we have at our disposal, we can lead to a significant reduction of cost and ultimately an improved ability to focus on what matters most. Now, the two that I think are some of the most egregious ones that we have in higher education in any business realm today are paper and PDF processes. Now, I would say, particularly since COVID started, I think the prevalence of paper, I would like to believe, is decreasing pretty significantly for institution processes, but that still leaves PDFs. And PDFs, Word documents, if you Google search processes on your campus, for example, you can quickly see how many of these typically exist. And while they're granted, they are digital in a sense, they're still really costly. So a survey by AIM done, I want to say it was done around 2014 or 15, so it's been a little bit of time, estimated that the average cost of a paper form, that would be labor, materials, and other processing time associated, was estimated at $3.63 per form. So annually, one estimate that I found online was that annually it's estimated that within the freshman to junior year, it's estimated that 10% or more of students change their major. So let's assume on a campus with 10,000 students, we're going to see about 1,000 major changes in a given year. That would equate to $3,600 or more just for one process, because this is, in this case, it's representing a paper form. But PDFs are also quite costly. And if you look at how many processes continue to happen on campus and the frequency of those, the costs quickly add up just for that process. According to a 2019 survey from SAP Concur, universities may spend up to 2 to 5 hours per expense report. So which at the universities surveyed, who processed over 400 expense reports per month, that equated to 2,000 wasted hours per month, or an equivalent of between 15 to 18 full-time employees. So again, that's one example of a process, but when I've heard an analysis of ROI, ROI isn't necessarily the cost of improvement, it's also the cost of staying in the status quo and how much the current environment is still costing. PDFs, like I said, aren't much better. An AIM survey again found that 65% of PDFs are still printed and scanned back in, which doesn't surprise me at all. I found corresponding surveys from research administrators that said I think at least 30% of PDFs are still printed and scanned because of the signature process on a PDF. In addition, PDFs can be costly just from a software standpoint of giving software, making software, the PDF software, available to everyone on an institution. So between these three things, the fact that we agree PDFs and paper are still costly, ultimately that can lead to an increased amount of errors on campus, more manual entry, working with either documents on paper, document like Word documents, or PDFs lead to manual entry, which leads to more errors in cleaning up mistakes. Can lead to potentially increased risk, because if you're printing a PDF, the average user will likely save that on their desktop. And in the scenario of malware that infects the desktop and has ransomware, there's a really big risk associated with having files saved on locally, not password protected behind something like a secure server. And then finally, it can lead to ultimately wasted time. All of these things are likely not revelations for anyone on the call today, but I think it's important to remember why some of the existing systems don't work as well as they could. So assuming we're all at that point and we say, okay, well, let's go ahead and begin looking for a no-code solution to help solve this problem on our campus. What I'm going to walk through is we have a pretty robust buying guide, which I will go ahead and include in the email follow-up to this in case you're interested in reviewing it. But I'll walk through the 5 steps that I would really recommend thinking about as you start looking for a no-code solution. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to do this webinar personally is because I've been in the no-code market for most of my career, and it's complicated. Whenever someone says, would ask me the question about, well, what solution is the best? There's a lot of solutions out there. And typically speaking, what we find with our partners, with our university partners, and with our customers is that a lot of solutions already exist on campus today that solve some of the needs for automation, which means, but they're not solving them all because they're still looking for a solution. So I'm going to walk through the first step that I would recommend in a process of if you're looking for something like a forms and workflow automation solution. Now, when I say that, I will say the no-code space is very broad. No code ultimately means a visual representation of doing something that otherwise a technical program with someone with technical expertise would do. There's different elements of the no code space. So the one that I'm focused most on today is enterprise application development. So forms and workflow automation would be, in a sense, what that would mean. Now, either way, what I would say is the process that I'll walk through, you could apply to any code you're looking for in the no code tool space. But today on the tools I'll focus on is more of the enterprise application development. First, I would say clarify what problem you're actually trying to solve. There's a lot of things you could solve. What process challenges are you experiencing? What solutions have been tried to solve that problem? And I really recommend as you go through the process of documenting that problem really clearly. So you can go back to it and say, is this solution we're looking at actually trying to solve this problem? Are you trying to simplify current processes? Are you trying to automate manual data entry tasks? Or maybe even provide solutions so people on campus can automate solutions themselves without having to work with IT to do that. I think not only clarifying the problem you're trying to solve, but ultimately, who are you solving it for is really important as well. Because if you're solving the problem and you want to enable your team in IT to move faster, it's a very different requirement and very different end user than solving the problem of requiring or moving departmental users faster. And the stakeholders you want to involve in that requirements gathering process are also very different. So I would document what problem and who you're trying to solve it for. Next, I would really recommend outlining, is the problem, what is holding you back from a solution today? I mentioned before, while I would love to say the tool will solve all of your problems, I'm an authentic marketer, and I will say the tool will definitely significantly contribute to the solution of the problem. But a problem typically around efficiency can be a people problem. Maybe you don't have the right people in place. Maybe they're not trained well. It can be a process problem. Taking a tool and implementing it over a broken process isn't going to fix the problem. So there's likely an element of process analysis and process overhaul you need as you're developing a forms and automation solution. Or ultimately, if you walk through that, is it a tool problem? You know that the processes that you could build are successful. You know that the people in place can actually work really well. And you ultimately just don't have the tool to enable them to move faster. Oftentimes, it's a combination of multiple problems. But by documenting it and being really clear about the root, what that does is when you're going to implementation, when you move forward to an implementation approach, you can be really clear about all of the things you need as part of that approach to really ultimately solve that problem and develop a full comprehensive solution. The third step I would say is understanding the types of tools in the market today. And that's really what we'll focus on in most of today's webinar. The low code, no code space has thousands of tools. You just Google Gartner and see I'll share some statistics today, but the growth of the space, it's unbelievable. And particularly the enterprise application development space or application development has, last time I spoke with Gartner, over 300 to 400 tools just in that space alone. So there's a lot of things that have been built to potentially solve this problem. So you really need to be clear about step one and step two, and then start to get a landscape of the land or a play of the land so you can start to understand where you go to fill those exact needs you're looking for. Number 4 is I would say understand if the gap you're trying to fill can be filled with one tool or if really ultimately you need to look at a portfolio of solutions. Now, again, today's webinar is really talking about what type of mix of solutions are we seeing institutions use in order to solve a variety of different problems. But sometimes, let's say, for example, it might be a department who's looking to solve just one very specific need. And that need has been clearly identified, and maybe there's only one tool you need to fill that gap, versus if you've identified a need that's more complex. Looking at multiple solutions might be a good idea. In most of our institutions, what we find is most campuses have at least 3 to 5 automation systems on campus today, all of which have some element of forms and workflows, solutioning. But there's still a need that we are finding is existing despite having that many systems on campus today. And then finally, as I'm sure many of you have already done, you just begin your search. That can be talking to institutions, speaking with analyst firms, looking online, visiting, hopefully in the next few months, trade shows. Maybe we'll see some of you at EDUCAUSE this year. But ultimately, you can begin that search once you have gone through it. I would recommend the first 4 steps of the process. So like I said, what I'd really like to focus on today is this step 3. Let's walk through the lay of the land in how do you think about different tool sets so you can start to understand, based upon the problem you're trying to solve, where you can start. Now, I set up a poll. I haven't done a poll in a while, so I'm going to go ahead and try to kick it off, and we'll see if it works. Okay, so this poll I'm going to ask is, I want to know from everyone on the call, how many no-code solutions or tools do you actually have on your campus today, in your perspective? So go ahead and start answering it. Once I see some answers come through, I'll go ahead and close the poll. Got most of them in. I'll leave it open for like 1 more second. Okay, let me go ahead and end that. That's interesting. I actually expected, well, most of the answers it looks like are at least minimum of 3. We've got 2 people that said they had 1 to 2 no-code tools. And then we've got about the rest of the attendees that is at least over 3 or more no-code tools. Some of you actually said that you had over 7 no-code tools, which that's quite a few on your campus. I like to ask that because it's interesting. My point earlier was that there's actually typically a lot of tools that exist, but again, there's generally a need that isn't being met even with that tool set. So we'll dive into why that might be as I walk through some of the tools that exist on campuses. So the first thing that I like to explain when it comes to the low code space, I'll say, is that Gartner defines the low code enterprise application development would be the magic quadrant you'd look for. But ultimately, there's 2 different elements of that space. There's either no code on one side of the spectrum and low code on the other side of the spectrum. The differentiating factor between these 2 things is if there's a level of technical expertise typically required, and if there's visual and or technical components required. With a level of technical expertise, so that would be either directed towards technical teams or technical team members, even within a department, that would be on the low code side of the space. Whereas no code is typically a purely visual application. So that would be focused on business users with little to no technical experience. This is a slide from Gartner that walks through a similar thing with the idea of citizen development is the term that says pretty much anyone in an institution could be a developer. Now there's 2 different ways you can again look at citizen development. You can either look at it on the low code spectrum, where it's slightly more technical and a power user with maybe technical expertise and development background could be on that side. Or you can look at citizen development on the no code spectrum, which would simply just be configuration-based tools. Now, again, this is not something that is new to the technology industry. No code has been around a really long time, but we're seeing, particularly with COVID, I would say, a lot of growth in the space. And in my opinion, one of the things that's really exciting for me about it is that I think by really enabling no-code application development across a campus, you can truly enable digital transformation because you're no longer just limited by bandwidth in one department. You can actually ultimately enable people across your entire campus to solve solutions collectively. Gartner predicts that by 2025, 70% of new applications will be developed using low-code or no-code technologies. So again, really exciting growth in that we're seeing more of these tools continue to perpetuate. As we saw in the poll, a lot of you already have these types of systems existing on your campus today. Now this slide, I'm not going to walk through again each of these individual sections. You can see we've got app builders, we have robotic process automation, which is a different side of no-code. But why I wanted to show this is that you can see there's a ton of tools out there. So we're going to walk through 5 different tools today and a different element of those tools. When you look into no code, or when you really look at finding a tool, I think there's kind of 3 elements I would recommend looking at as you're thinking about how does this fit in my portfolio. The first element would be the actual functionality. So what functionality does this tool bring that might be able to solve some of those solutions I documented earlier in this process? And ultimately, does it meet my overall needs? There's a lot of guides out there around the functionality each of the different tool sets bring. And obviously you can do things like demos and POCs and et cetera, to dive into that more. The second item I would look at is how complex is the tool to use? So this is an area I feel like the no code space struggles with, because, and I'll say no code specifically, because there's this desire to try to make a tool so robust that it has so many features that solves the need, that it ends up getting to the point where the tool actually diverges away from the ability to enable non-technical citizen developers. So doing a demo is really recommended. And what I would also recommend, and why I said earlier, document whom you're trying to solve the problem for, is bring stakeholders from your process. If your goal is to enable citizen developers that are non-technical, bring them into the process and have them test the tool. Because a lot of these tools, while they seem easy if you're in IT to test them, can actually be more complex for an end user without a business analyst or a technical experience background. So while complexity is important because it can both represent power, it can also mean lack of accessibility on campus. More complex from a user experience standpoint can mean you have less people that have the ability to use it. And while that might mean more power, that isn't necessarily always the trade-off. And then thirdly, I would say, how is it priced? Pricing can, typically we're seeing value-based pricing, ideally, in the market today. But ultimately, the tool should be priced to align with the value you are attempting to achieve from that tool. And I'll walk through that a little bit more as we talk through different tool sets. So this is how I personally, and what I've seen in different market reports, think of the no-code space. We've got on one side, e-sign tools, and you move up as you go from the left side of the slide to the right side of the slide in the functionality of capability. And we'll walk through this, like I said. But one thing to note is that some tools do just one of these things, and some tools do them all. So again, going back to complexity, and I said, I think the no-code vendors are trying to do them all, but be wary of that in the sense, does it increase the complexity to where it's unusable? So again, ask some of these questions as you're looking at a tool set. I would say, what does the tool do? Does it solve the need I'm looking for? How easy is it to use? So again, complexity. And then I would also ask, what's my future vision for where I need this problem to go? And will this tool scale with my needs as I continue to grow up in terms of solving that problem? With power often comes complexity. So think through that and remember to test things in advance. And then I think this is really important because the other challenge of having a tool, and why we see a lot of tools on campus, is that most tools are priced to do one thing really well. So I'll walk through enterprise content management systems. Enterprise content management systems have developed no-code capabilities, but ultimately they're still priced like an enterprise content management system. So the pricing model can really influence if your tool is solving the needs you need it to, based upon the actual problem you're trying to solve. One of the things that we're seeing in the market, so this is from a 2021 OpenView, which is a SaaS investment firm survey, is that usage-based pricing and transaction-based pricing is increasing in the market. Traditional on-premises pricing functionally was limited by seats and users, so that still is the predominant pricing model, but we're continuing to see an increase. I think I saw a survey from, I want to say 2016, where in about 4 to 5 years, that's doubled. And we'll see that trend potentially continue over the next few years. So let's start walking through each of these elements so you can understand the different capabilities that are in the lay of the land of no code. The first is eSign. So eSign tools, most of you probably have a tool like this on your campus today, Adobe Sign, DocuSign. And these are really good for contracts. In fact, on the Gartner Magic Quadrant, I think DocuSign is one of the leaders in contract management lifecycle, or contract lifecycle management. So the idea of this tool is I have a very specific document and I need to send it from person A to person B. What's good about that is you can use an existing template or document. There's not a lot of change management in building that, from the ground up, but there's a fair amount of limited functionality, which is why I placed it on the full left-hand spectrum for the capabilities. There is some workflow automation, you could say, built into these tools, like basic routing. But generally speaking, you have to know who you're routing it to. And there's a limited ability to add additional data input into something like an eSign tool. So for the vendor example for this tool, I'm actually going to highlight Adobe Sign. So Adobe Sign, the functionality and the complexity, I would say, is on the lower end of this entire spectrum. The price I put in the middle because the price of Adobe Sign is usage-based. It's a common, well, Adobe Sign particularly can either be a per user seat license or a usage-based license. What we're finding in feedback we've heard from universities, either with Adobe Sign or DocuSign, is that the usage-based or transaction-based licensing has been significantly increasing their costs, especially as adoption has filtered onto these tools. Some of the solutions, in fact, if you're interested, I'm doing a webinar tomorrow about how to save your cost with eSign tools, because it's a big problem we're hearing on campuses nowadays. So the price is variable depending on the total usage you have for the tool itself. And there's obviously ways to combat that, but you have to be prepared to have a transaction licensing model for the tool like this. So when we, again, think about what's the problem I'm trying to solve, if I want to give this to my entire campus and say, go crazy, there's a level of risk associated with the pricing model for a tool like that. And I would say it's limited in the sense that you can only use, generally speaking, documents in their existing form, which limits your ability to think creatively about optimizing the process and redoing a process versus using an existing process. So let's go to the next version, which I would say would be digital forms. Digital forms, in how I'm defining this, is a front-end form where I can change the different fields. I have multiple field options that I can put in. There's no automation really on the back end. So as soon as that form goes through, it's sent to a general collection database, and someone or a set of people can be notified that a new form has been submitted. They're generally really easy to configure and use. They're typically quite inexpensive and or free, depending on what platform they're available in. Some of the cons, I would say, is tools like this typically have a limited ability to integrate with other systems. They, depending on the vendor, may have security challenges and more often scalability challenges. So if you try to stretch a tool like this too far, you're going to find, I would say, gaps in the ability to solve a more complex use case. The example I'm going to use here is Google Forms, and most of us have probably used Google Forms at some point. Google Forms is free for an independent user. There is a price if you are on Google business apps, and that's, I believe, a per user seat license. But again, the functionality of this is quite low. The complexity, with power comes complexity. Complexity is also quite low. It's really easy to use, and the price is pretty affordable. Google Forms, I would say, is an example of what we have heard from institutions as shadow systems popping up on campus, because it's free, typically, for an independent user, super easy to use, and that's why people on campuses will say, this is a tool I can use to solve my immediate need. But the challenge, again, is scalability. If you're having a lot of independent forms pop up and people end up using incorrect email addresses, there's a level of risk from a security standpoint for the information once those forms are submitted, and a level of risk around the scalability of being able to roll that out across a campus installation. Okay, the next one I want to focus on is app creation. Now, apps can mean a lot of different things. In this case, what I'm referring to specifically is a mobile app creation. So software that's intended to only create truly a mobile app on a cell phone. The use case, again, would be true app mobile creation. The pro of doing this is it's easy to create mobile native apps. So really good for automating a student-facing process, for example. But in researching these tools, I have found that they can be quite challenging for non-technical users, just in the user interface of how the tool is built. And there can be a limited ability to move a mobile app into a desktop application as well to make it a more varied and versatile use case. The vendor example I'll use here is Microsoft Power Apps. So Power Apps is, I would say, a good tool to use just for this use case. At times it can be included in Microsoft's business suite. I think Microsoft Office 365 or Business 365. Or it can also be licensed on an independent user per user basis. While the functionality, again, is good, I actually did some highlighting on eSign and digital forms because this application has the ability to also do those types of things. I think the complexity of this can be quite high. In reading reviews on Power Apps and in trying to use it myself, I found that if you didn't have a technical background to just understand some terminology around application development, there can be a high learning curve for someone logging in and trying to use a tool like this. I put the price on this slide a little on the lower end because it's typically included if you already are using Microsoft installation across your campus. Next is document management. So an enterprise content management solution is really good for complex or document-centric processes, like think of legal or HR documents, particularly those that have an archival lifecycle at the end of them. The pro is that the automation in something like this generally centers around a document hub, but the con typically, I would say, is IT typically owns that solution. And there's not, I would say, a level of really good governance capabilities built in where you could roll it out across a campus without controls that take a long time to build in. So IT would typically own and build on a solution like that. So a lot of institutions use OnBase from Hyland. That's the example I'm going to use in this case. And you'll see that I've unbolded. They have eSign and form and workflow automation components. It can be quite pricey. And again, this is on a per user seat license, plus a lot of add-ons that you could do with OnBase. The functionality is pretty robust, but typically it would require, I think, IT to be involved and or own a level of the process in managing an installation or process automation through OnBase. And then again, the complexity, because IT has to be involved, I put as a little higher as well. And then on the left-hand side would be workflow automation. Now, I find the term workflow to be complicated because workflow can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. In this case, what I would say is the ability to route complex decisions through a multi-step approval process and have advanced logic built in would be what I would define as workflow. There's the ability to, the pros of something like this is it significantly can improve process efficiencies and really ultimately lead to optimized task management for end users. The con, depending on the solution, is sometimes to go through a workflow installation process, someone may need to look at their processes and say, how do we make these better? So a workflow automation tool isn't good for taking one process and slapping it onto a new tool. Workflow automation is really good for saying, how do we optimize this process as we build it into a new tool set? I will use, in this case, ServiceNow as an example of a workflow automation tool. ServiceNow is a support and ticketing tool. A lot of higher education institutions use ServiceNow. It has the ability to do workflow automation on the back end and approval routing or complex logic built in. Can be quite pricey. It's typically based off of a combination of annual revenue and seat licenses, as well as quite a few add-ons potentially. And what I have learned in speaking with institutions that use ServiceNow is that it can also be complex in it's somewhat, from my understanding, like Salesforce, where when you build a Salesforce installation, you have an environment of Salesforce and all of the rules and logic are built around that environment. So having the ability to be agile and develop a one-off use case for this that doesn't work in that current environment can be somewhat complex, which means typically the service owner would need to be involved. And generally, ServiceNow is owned by IT, so there still is a level of involvement from IT. So that should give you a fairly good lay of the land in terms of different tool sets that are available on campuses or that you could use, the different elements of a tool to consider. Now, the next thing I want to walk through is, how do you know if you should just have one tool or multiple tools? How do you create a portfolio of solutions that really solve the ultimate need you're looking for? Well, I'm going to go back to the first few slides that I had, in which case, as you're thinking through that problem, what I would really recommend is think about, again, what functionality does the tool have and how robust do I need to solve the exact need that I need at this time? How is it priced, or how complex is the tool to use in terms of who am I enabling to solve their problems? And how is it priced overall based upon the value I'm attempting to achieve from the tool? Those three factors, I think, will help influence strongly the decision you need to make in terms of how you should start thinking about the tool set you need for your portfolio. Again, some tools do just one thing, some tools do them all, but with power, typically, not always, comes complexity. So thinking through that, I would say, is important as you think about who are we enabling to solve the problem. And then really thinking about the pricing model for the tool in terms of what are you enabling is really important as well. Usage-based or seat-based licensing models can be really good in certain circumstances when you only need a certain level of people to have access to an application. Also, seat-based licensing models can be really good if they have functionality built in based upon user permissioning. But and transaction-based models can also be really good if you recognize or think that you can control the risk around a transaction model, and you can have stopgap measures built in so you can enable adoption at a scalable rate. Or you can find a model that's actually built for higher education, which I'll talk about. I want to show two portfolio examples for Kuali Build, some of the customers, our customers, and some of the tool sets they use, so you can get a sense of how some other institutions have approached this problem and what they've found to be useful. So the first one I want to show is UC San Diego. UC San Diego is, I will transparently admit, is a design partner for Kuali Build. Design partner means that they had a financial investment several years ago in Build because they recognized that there's a really big need on their campus that isn't being solved right now. And Kuali had a vision for what that looked like. But I want to walk through some of the tools they use on their campus so you can understand how they all fit together. So UC San Diego uses OnBase. They use OnBase typically for long-term document storage and archival. They also use it because OnBase has process automation components built in. They're now using it for long-standing, non-iterative or more complex integrated processes that IT typically will support. So the processes that they're planning to exist a really long time that don't need to be agile and that are really connected to document workflow, they're using OnBase to do those types of things. They're using Adobe Sign, and that's, again, what I said eSign tools are really good for is peer-to-peer document sharing and or approvals. So less complex approval processes where a contract or a document already exists and they need to route it through a series of approvals. ServiceNow, so they're using that mainly within IT for things like tech support or ticket routing or things like that. Now, there's always been, in those first three examples, there's sometimes times where they might try that for another tool or try that for another process solution. But what they found was that those three tools weren't solving the problem of actually enabling true no-code development. So years ago, they invested in the development of Kuali Build. And today they're using Kuali Build on their campus to really empower agile, easy to use, no-code automation across their campus. They've been in a rollout process over the last year to year and a half or so. But ultimately what that means is that someone who's not technical can actually log in and automate tools without having IT's immediate or direct oversight over what that process looks like. So it can allow them to move quite a bit faster. And the other portfolio example that I'll show is Davidson College. So you'll see some of the same tools that OnBase and DocuSign. Davidson is also using those tool sets. And again, for those similar type of experiences of quick e-signing and or long-term document storage, they are using Build again to enable their no-code use cases. So Davidson, when they were looking for a no-code solution, ended up looking at multiple vendors. They actually started with the Gartner Magic Quadrant and found that 90% of the things they were actually trying to solve for required end user engagement. And most of the tools they were finding on Gartner's Magic Quadrant were just too complicated to put in the hands of someone that really wasn't a developer, that even wasn't a power user, if you remember that slide set earlier. So they're using Kuali Build to do two things: to actually enable no-code development across their campus for end users, as well as they're actually using it as a front-end UI to automate the application development process within IT. So rather than having to code applications themselves, if they use Kuali Build as a no-code UI to make that happen faster, their team can actually move faster. And then they're using an iPaaS platform called SnapLogic to, once they develop a front-end face of the Kuali Build application, and users can input information there, they're using SnapLogic somewhat as like a connecting block between the two to transition data into a format they need, and then pass it into other systems as appropriate. So those are two examples of ways that, again, going back to that poll I had asked, having one no-code solution, depending on your size of campus, it actually might be beneficial to look at multiple tools because each of these tools are solving a different and unique problem. So we've got a few minutes left. I want to walk through really quickly at a very high level kind of what Kuali Build is, just to give you a snapshot of it, and then I'll open it up for questions. And please, I'd love any thoughts, questions, comments that you have. So Kuali Build is, again, a no-code application platform built exclusively. We only sell into higher education. And we provide the ability for non-technical users to develop an application, which would be a form and a workflow backend with pretty powerful and robust routing and integration capabilities. So again, if you look at my slide, complete set of capabilities with ease of use, our goal is to enable pretty much all of these, but keeping it simple. So someone who's actually non-technical can use the tool. What we found when we began looking at developing Kuali Build, we have been, Kuali, if you're not familiar, has been in higher education. We actually were born out of higher education institutions that wanted to work more effectively. They said there's got to be a better way we can work with vendors and actually build modular solutions that actually solve the needs that we have versus really robust behemoth solutions. So about 5 years ago, we kept hearing this need about, like, we have so many tools. We've got PDFs that still are super persistent on campus today. And we also have 3 to 5 tools that should be solving this problem, but they're actually not. And in quite a few interviews and validation with university partners, including our design partners, what we found is that there's this sweet spot between really powerful and complex systems on campus, like think your ERP, your, in some cases, Salesforce or CRM, where they're really advanced and they have a lot of power, but ultimately they aren't accessible to the end user and they're expensive to purchase and maintain. And then on the other side, you've got really easy and simple solutions. Think like Google Forms, like I talked about earlier. While they often pop up on campus because they're easy to use, they're inexpensive, they generally don't meet all the security, scalability, and business requirements that IT needs. So we believe there's this sweet spot in the middle where it's a system that's actually powerful enough to do all the things you need to do, like successfully integrate across data across your campus, and actually do system orchestration across systems, like is completely necessary and has the complexity to handle really complex business processes. But our focus has been the entire time we've built Build, it has to be easy enough that someone who hates systems actually likes using it. So we've removed all the non-technical speak, or we've removed all the technical speak. We've kept it really non-technical. And our goal has just been, let's make something that's really powerful, but actually fun for someone to use. This is, I'm going to give you a few snapshots. So this is the dashboard of Build, where you can see we have different applications, form and workflow combination, where someone can really easily create a process automation to solve their needs. Our form builder allows for the ability to brand a form based upon an institution design, and you can show or hide fields based upon user context or input, with the ability to have back office sections as well. Simple drag and drop builder allows anyone to really easily create a form on campus with, again, no technical expertise. And we've got a workflow designer that allows really diverse activities like routing, approvals, acknowledgement, and even fairly complex branching based upon input within the earlier form design. So you can actually route to specific individuals across the entire institution, like, for example, that college chair, dean, or the dean of the college that consistently changes and you don't always know who that person is. The system is built in with the identity management, so it always knows who is filling a role because it's built as connected with your own institution identity management. And then on this slide, you'll see at the very end, we also have integrations. So you can configure the integration once on the back end, and then the business user can actually enable system orchestration without having a technical knowledge of needing to actually code the integration with each new application. So this is just a highlight of some of the things that our users say about Build, but ultimately why I love this slide is it actually reinforces some of the things we've been trying to do. Is we care a lot about design. It's really easy. I'll talk a little bit about the licensing model because we actually wanted to build something that fit higher education and enabled adoption. We really focus on integration and making it accessible across the entire campus. And we really focus on just providing really quality service to our institutions because we understand higher education, because we were born from it. Let me talk a little bit about the pricing model just so you can get a sense of what that looks like. Our pricing model is built off of a combination of full-time employees and students, and there's 3 different tiers of what that model looks like. But it has unlimited users and unlimited form submissions as well. So the idea of how we built the model is that we really believe a no-code tool should enable adoption versus preventing it. So the model is really focused on, for a campus-wide installation, again, I said there's 3 tiers, enabling really strong and solid adoption across a campus to actually enable transformation. So if you're interested, we have a weekly demo, happens tomorrow, actually at Pacific time. That slide is incorrect, 1 o'clock Pacific time or 2 o'clock Mountain time. You can sign up online on our website, and we'll go ahead and send out the information if you're interested after the call, or you can always just get in touch with us if you'd like to know more. The other thing I'll make a silent plug on if you're interested is UC San Diego is actually doing a really cool event right now. They've done it annually, but with COVID, it actually forced them to move it entirely virtual, so all institutions can attend. It's called their Process Palooza, and it is an event focused on Lean Six Sigma process improvement initiatives. It's free training. In fact, I think one of their workshops is Lean Six Sigma White Belt certification training. So if you or anyone in your team is interested, that kicked off, I want to say last week, but they have, I think, 6 weeks of content every Tuesday happening over the next few weeks. One of those sessions is also UC San Diego. We'll be discussing how they've used Build in the context of their other applications. So if you go online, you can look up UC San Diego Process Palooza 2021, and or Annie, if you want, you can share the link in the chat as well. But excellent opportunity to learn a little bit more if your mind is on process improvement initiatives right now. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. Hopefully you found this beneficial. Like I said, we will go ahead and follow up with an email with the recording, both for those who attended and were not able to attend. And if you have any questions, requests, just let us know. Go ahead and respond to that email. Have a great rest of your morning, and we'll talk soon. Thanks.